Okay, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Creedal Catholic, a Catholic theology and apologetics podcast that is faithful to the magisterium and dedicated to the mission of the new evangelization. I think you're going to like our topic that we have lined up today. We are going to be talking about Quentin Tarantino and the theology that we see in his movies and some other philosophical ideas that we see coming through them. And to talk about Quentin Tarantino, I have a cleric of the church whose last name is Barron, who talks about pop culture. It is not Bishop Barron. You may have heard of that name, but this is actually the greater Barron, Father Jim Barron. Father Barron is my pastor at Holy Apostles Church in Colorado Springs. He is also one of two associate directors of vocations for the Diocese of Colorado Springs. So if you're listening to this and you might be interested in discerning a vocation, you can reach out to Father Jim and talk about that. He also holds an STL, that is a licentiate in sacred theology, in marriage and family life studies from the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family Life Studies in Rome. So, Father, you were in Rome for 4 years doing that? 5 years?
5 years.
That's awesome. Well, welcome to Creedal Catholic.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here, and hopefully you'll have such a good time. You'll want to come on more because I'd love to have you back for more conversations.
Absolutely.
This is, I hope, just the beginning. I still want to dig into the topic of your licentiate thesis, talking about Alistair McIntyre and Rene Girard. I had Leah Labresco on the show a couple weeks ago, and she talked about Alistair McIntyre as one of the formative influences in her decision to become Catholic.
Wonderful.
Yeah, she said that she was an atheist and read McIntyre and thought, this is it. This is how an atheist can have a coherent ethical framework. And then she found out to her dismay at the time that McIntyre then became Catholic. Mm-hmm. So pretty cool. But today we're going to talk about Quentin Tarantino. Mm-hmm. I know you're a big fan of his work. You were over at my house for dinner last month, I think it was, and you mentioned Pulp Fiction is one of your favorite movies. Mm-hmm. And I thought that's a really interesting opinion about that movie. And I'd love to hear you explain more about that. And then I know that you also have some interesting ideas about Inglourious Basterds, and you just saw his movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which has been all the rage. I think it might get a few Oscar nominations based on what I've been reading. I've not yet seen it. I've not been able to get to the theaters yet to see it, but it looks really interesting. Maybe his most interesting yet. I don't know. I'll have to get your opinion on that. But I'd like to talk to you about Tarantino. And so maybe I'll start off with this question. What's your favorite Tarantino movie?
You know, at this point, I would say Inglourious Basterds.
Okay.
Yep. Why? Because, well, first, he's a master of dialogue, and what that man can do with the script and how he can use dialogue to sort of draw the viewer into the movie more and more intensely. And then especially in that movie, you see the use of comic relief. For example, there's the opening scene where you've got a car full of Nazis bringing Hans Landa, the arch villain, to this small French farmhouse, and they're questioning, trying to find Jews that he believes are hiding in the house. And, you know, this scene is just getting more and more intense, and it's all in the original language, which I think is also brilliant.
Right.
Somebody had said, and I wish I had this sort of citation of this quote, or who told me, but they said that this was the first film that Tarantino made after watching The Passion of the Christ, which was all in original language. And he drew that idea, or that inspired him to do so for Inglourious Basterds. So just the power of dialogue and all in the original language. And then again, you have this arch villain who speaks, he's a polyglot, several different languages. But in this really intense opening scene, you see all of a sudden, as you know, you think the tension can't get any tighter, he pulls out this cartoonish smoking pipe, and it sort of breaks the tension so that he can go even more tense and sort of lead you into it even more. So just the use of the dialogue, how he displays that, but also that's really his, I think, tour de force, at least up to that point, spoken through the words of Brad Pitt at the end of the movie, as he's, you know, after he's just carved a swastika into another Nazi's forehead.
Right.
He says, you know, speaking to his little coworker, you know, I think this might be my best work yet. You know, he's saying that in the person of the character, but also that's Tarantino saying that about the film.
Right.
And it displays the power of film. Just with the whole nature of the thing itself, what happens in the climax of the movie. And I don't know how much you want me to go into this. I could go on forever.
Oh, yeah, keep going.
But so you've got not only a lot of the great references to other films. Tarantino is a big, he's a very promiscuous film viewer and art consumer. And you see that present in every one of his films. He'll have a lot of different hat tips and references with a screenshot, with a particular quote from a character. But in this one, you see especially not only the use of sort of homage to previous films, But the whole climax of the movie and the downfall of the bad guys happens in a movie theater with film being set on fire to cause this great blaze. But it's even more so, that's kind of the window dressing. I believe you got to get through his window dressing to see even some of the more deep messages, whether or not it's intentional. This is another thing we should talk about tonight. But there's something there. So in this one, the power of film, you see Joseph Goebbels, he was the minister of propaganda for the Third Reich. He's kind of orchestrated this whole evening celebrating the triumph of the Nazi regime through one of its soldiers who was being decorated and recognized for his work, basically killing American soldiers as a sniper. And so he creates this whole film about this occasion. And this is the occasion when Hitler himself comes with another of the other high-ranking Nazi officials and people that are high up in the Third Reich. And that's the moment where you start to see this climax build to its peak. And you see the Nazis cheering as they watch the character in the bird's nest up in the bell tower picking off Americans. And of course, you feel as an American a bit of disgust at that.
Yeah, there's sort of a visceral reaction.
Yeah. And in some ways, I think the Nazis are it was almost not a non-issue, just who it was. They needed a bad guy. And the Nazis are the archetypal bad guys. But by showing this and showing their behavior to that kind of a view, then you see one of the Inglourious Basterds, one of the guys who was commissioned to go basically on a suicide mission to kill Hitler. He's in the balcony from an elevated position picking off the Nazis. And so at that point, Tarantino kind of holds up a mirror to us in the audience. We were disgusted at these people cheering on that sniper.
And
what are we doing?
Right.
Is this something that has drawn us into it? Again, the power of propaganda, the power of film. And, so I think a lot of that, he's got such a great way of drawing the audience into the moral issues that are being brought up for consideration, again, intentionally or unintentionally.
Well, I think it would be a mistake to think that could be unintentional, because it's sort of like a great piece of painted art, right? Something like that, every detail has been painstakingly poured over by the artist for hours per square inch, probably. And so it's, if you look at a figure and think, I wonder why this person's pinky is folded where the ring finger is not, that's not going to be an unintentional decision by the artist. So there's going to be a reason there for it. And so similarly, I think with a movie, Tarantino, like you said, he tells the audience through Brad Pitt, this is his best work yet. This is something that he put thousands of hours into probably while he was making it and writing it and directing it. And so I think we have to see all of these things as intentional to at least some degree.
Yeah.
And even if they're not fully consciously intentional, any artist, whenever they're making any work, they have their unconscious thoughts and intentions express themselves on the canvas or the page or the film, whatever. So I think there's a degree of intentionality to every part of that.
I think that's fair. And Tarantino, he is so widely read and has seen so many films, both popular and obscure, and he's so free to kind of pick and choose and borrow and imitate, but he does so, and what results is so utterly original. And so, the things that he might be intending to say could also be coming across as something that looks exactly like something that was in a film 40 years ago.
Right. Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I've sort of been on an interesting pilgrimage myself with respect to Tarantino's films, because so Inglourious Basterds, for example, I've seen it exactly once. And after that once, I turned it off and was just like, what did I just watch? This was gratuitously violent and I didn't understand the point. And it was pretty shocking. I think that's intentional, like we just talked about. All of those things are by design. But let's talk about that for a little bit. I think the chief objection to Tarantino is that he's just too much, that the violence is just too much, that it's gratuitous. Pretty sure my parents have never seen a Tarantino film, for example, but if they did, they'd probably be horrified and they'd probably make it 5 minutes in, depending on the movie, maybe a minute in, and then they would just turn it off and would never watch another Tarantino film. So talk to me about that. What's the deeper significance of the violence in these films? Because they do get pretty horrifying.
I don't know if he would say that there's real significance to it other than the fact what he does with it. It's very theatrical and it makes you very uncomfortable, which may just be the point, where you've got 10 people being killed in a Tarantino film and you feel every drop of blood that's spilled, versus, Rambo with a huge body count. Yeah, you got 100 people blown away and you just don't blink an eyelash.
Right.
Like, it's okay, move on. And so I think in some ways the fact that he makes the audience feel it, even if it is theatrical, and that's probably exactly the vehicle that he uses to make us feel it. I think it's probably maybe responsible isn't the best word, but I do think that there's something to say about having to stop and think about death and killing and the violence that we see, and it should make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think there's something to that approach, because as you were talking about how he makes the audience uncomfortable and other movies don't, I was just thinking about the Marvel movies, for example. I mean, the destruction and carnage that happens in your average Marvel movie is on a scale totally different from a Tarantino film, because Tarantino is, a man might walk into a room and kill 5 people in the room. In a Marvel movie, you'll watch, half of New York be disintegrated, right? And countless people with it. And yet, when you're watching Marvel, you're not thinking about that at all.
Right.
You're just like, oh, wait, come on, Iron Man, you can get him.
Exactly.
Totally different approach. And so Tarantino, I think, he makes you squeamish, but I think it's probably by design. And that then makes me wonder if there's anything to a comparison between Flannery O'Connor and Tarantino. I'm not sure if you've read much O'Connor.
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, she's a master of this sort of grotesque violence as well. I think the most representative example that's accessible, if any of the listeners want to pick up and read A Good Man Is Hard to Find. It's just a short story, but it is a great example of the shocking carnage that can take place in an O'Connor story. And she's obviously asked about this because it's one of her signatures in her work. And she says that it's basically a way to introduce grace, because it's only through the shocking realization of how badly in need of grace we are that one can come to appreciate the grace that we're offered. So what do you think about an O'Connor-Tarantino comparison? Is there anything there?
I absolutely. I think so. O'Connor had very little patience for whitewashing the human condition. I think I don't know if she was a fan of Bonhoeffer, but certainly didn't believe in cheap grace either.
Right.
There's a letter that she wrote to Christian artists and their responsibility to be honest and sincere when it comes to the human condition, that there's something that they have a responsibility of portraying what is true. And without that, then you really risk minimizing the condition into which God reaches out to us. And it whitewashed humanity is bad art. I realize that there's a place for a lot of the cinema that has a very strong Christian message, but in many ways it's just spoon-fed. And it's very, not just accessible, but it's a violation of the craft. I think there's no real tension. It's sort of a dramatized, sort of surface level tension in most of the films.
It's sort of like the Thomas Kincaid of film.
Yes, that's a good. I like that. So Flannery O'Connor, again, very much about the human condition and sin, the reality of sin, and she's not afraid to look at it right in the face, and she wants to invite her readers to do the same thing. I think that's a great parallel to Tarantino, that the humans are capable of terrible things, and we gotta realize that. I'm sure you've heard of Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
he has a very important insight about not kind of raising our kids to be naive and to think that they themselves or other people aren't capable of sin and of bad actions and of harm. Without that, then we have nothing to say about an El Paso or a Dayton. God rest the souls of the victims and comfort their families. But these things are real, as horrifying as they are, and they should horrify us, because that shows the depths of sort of a nihilistic, godless, dark way of looking at the world. But if we pretend it's not there, or that so many people aren't capable of something like that, then I think we're really doing ourselves and the next generation a disservice. If we whitewash humanity, then we're kind of anesthetizing ourselves in some ways.
I want to get back to this discussion of the theology of Tarantino, but your last point there made me think of a possible objection to viewing these movies. And that is that the objection would go something like this: why do I need to watch these movies or engage with these works of art when I already know how bad the world is?
Sure.
And I've heard this objection because, as you know, I'm a big Breaking Bad fan. I do a whole podcast on Breaking Bad. I know you haven't seen it yet, but you really should. It's great. But that's a pretty dark show. And the whole reason why I think Breaking Bad is brilliant is is for some of these same reasons that you're talking about Tarantino's brilliance. And that's that it illuminates the human condition in a way that I haven't seen illuminated before or outside of that show. But people say, why do I need to watch this? I already know how dark the world is. You know, what I need when I get home from work at the end of the day is something uplifting. And so, I mean, I understand the need for uplifting things. But my response to them, I think, is something like, you may think you know how bad the world is or how bad the human condition is, but this show will tell you something that you didn't know already about it. And I think it's good for us to be acquainted with our condition so that we can be better prepared to encounter the grace of God. But that's my response, though. I'm curious to hear what you would say to that.
Sure. There's a certain point where I stopped being sort of an evangelizer for Quentin Tarantino.
Sure.
Not because I don't think his films are great or that there's not something that's fruitful to draw from them, but you know, everybody's in a different place in their own sensibilities, and you know, I want to respect that. And there are other ways to be confronted with the fallenness of human nature. You know, if we spend any time even in looking at our own consciences, unless we have a great amount of pride, overweening pride, then we're going to be confronted with the fact that we fail, we're broken, we need help.
Yeah.
So it's a proximate issue, the idea of what human beings are capable of, but to your point, this is a good way to kind of name it and to see it. And, the purpose of stories is to kind of engage the imagination. And by engaging the imagination, you start to engage other things like aspiration for virtue, or you can learn lessons from other people. You know, the great moral fairy tales, or you can learn about how to grow in virtue or vices to avoid based on these characters. And so, it can be a helpful thing, but, like I said, it's not something that I say everybody needs to see, because, some people just have a certain sensibility that this would unnecessarily scandalize them. And I just don't want to do that. So I usually limit my recommendations to kind of, a passing remark, like, I enjoyed this film. The more I get to know somebody and I think that they would be able to benefit from it, then, I would share that and say, hey, let's watch this. I'd like to explain it to you.
I think that's a good recommendation, especially coming from someone like you who has pastoral experience, because it is a good reminder. I mean, not everyone has the same level of sort of squeamishness or the same tolerance for these types of things. And I think it's probably accurate to say that there's not necessarily anything intrinsically good about Tarantino's films, but that the attitude or the approach you bring to consuming them reflects on the morality of the art itself.
Yeah.
And so it's not for everyone, I think, is accurate. I mean, maybe in some ways, you'd go into some people's house and you have a piece of art that is pretty dark, and then you go into another person's house and they might have a lot of those little precious moments, angels sitting on shelves. I don't want to pass judgment on people who have precious moments, angels. That's the art that speaks to them in that way. So that's all good. But let's talk about Tarantino's theology. As I was prepping a little bit for our conversation here, I found that there is a book-length discussion of Tarantino's theology called, appropriately, Tarantino and Theology. And it has about 10 or so essays from various scholars talking about Tarantino and theology. So this is not a new topic. People have definitely explored the nexus of Tarantino and theology in the recent years. I think that book was published in 2015 or 2016. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a lot to discuss here. And we already talked about the similarities between Tarantino and O'Connor. O'Connor, of course, was a very devout Catholic, extraordinarily devout. Tarantino apparently grew up Catholic. That's what I saw.
I hadn't heard that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I saw that online. Also wouldn't surprise me. I'm pretty sure he's not a practicing Catholic now.
Good chances.
Fairly certain on that. But I did encounter an interesting question about him that someone posed online, and that is, do you think Tarantino is a pre-modern or a postmodern filmmaker? I think a postmodern filmmaker, and please chime in here if you think that my explanations could use some clarifications or corrections. But I think a postmodern filmmaker would be conveying the message that none of our systems for evaluating ethical action are adequate because there is no good system for evaluating ethical action. I think a pre-modern filmmaker would say we've missed the mark on evaluating ethical action because we should be placing a premium on different priorities for ethical action or for ethical decision making, things like tribal loyalty and things like that. So what do you think? Pre-modern, postmodern, and do you have clarifying comments on the distinction?
I think so often with postmodern art, they kind of do away with many forms, but also meaning itself.
Right.
You know, there is no meaning, or at least the meaning is in the viewer.
So it's quasi-nihilist, perhaps?
Maybe not. I think it's more, you know, like an expressionist. They're putting something on canvas, but then they want the viewer to sort of come to their own conclusions. You know, they might have them, but they don't want to insist on what the viewer sees. Whereas like postmodern, like there is no meaning. It's just of there. It's a statement, and you know, it's meant to just kind of echo through the nothingness.
Right.
I think with Tarantino's films, you see characters that are very much kind of pre-modern, that they do have some form to their lives, that there is some identified code that they live according to, and they might still be trying to work it out, but they are thrust into this world that has lost those forms. You know, Tarantino has a certain amount of nostalgia for the 1950s and 60s and sort of those values that ended up going over to Italy with the spaghetti westerns after America kind of, you know, threw itself into hippiedom. But, you know, with the 1968 and afterwards, when you see who described, I think it was quoted in that article, that's the year that the West attempted suicide. It was just kind of I think that's a very good way to understand it. And this is the culture into which he introduces a lot of his characters. You know, in the scene in Reservoir Dogs where they're talking about tipping, you know, and the morality behind that, that's an example of, you know, wrestling in this formlessness to try to have something that is formable or something that you can kind of identify and cling to. And so many of his other characters that would be, you know, ostensibly the heroes, Uma Thurman in the Kill Bill series, she operates according to a certain code, but everybody else in sort of the world in which she lives, there are elements of it, and especially sort of the Shinto and the Japanese warrior culture. But otherwise, you know, everything seems to be up for grabs. And
Pulp Fiction, I think, is much like that as well.
It turns out, I think you see the characters develop in such a way where there's a divergence with, you know, John Travolta's character. He kind of maintains that formlessness, especially after the miracle, at least which Samuel L. Jackson identifies that.
Right.
And Jackson embraces sort of the form. He embraces that sort of structured existence. Whereas Travolta just says it's nothing. It was a coincidence. It was just a freak accident. And you see how his life goes and what happens to Samuel L. Jackson and his character. You see it also with Bruce Willis, and you know he was sort of in many ways sort of an active nihilist. But then, as he and Ving Rhames are in the basement of the infamous pawn shop, there's a moment where he makes a choice for defending his former enemy, or you know he stops being his enemy and becomes his friend at that moment, where he decides to come back and save his life. And it might have been more out of hatred for the perpetrators of the crime, but in that moment he does make a choice and lends form to his life and to Ving Rhames' life, and their relationship now has a new definition, where it's effectively he's engaged in this action of redemption. You know, Samuel L. Jackson embraces redemption at that moment. Bruce Willis embraces a form of redemption, and it's worth noting as he goes back to his hubby or his significant other. I don't know. I never really understood if they were married or not.
Yeah.
But you know, as he's going there with the chopper, you know, whose motorcycle is this? It's a chopper, baby. Well, whose chopper is this? Zed. Who's Zed? Zed's dead. But if you notice on the gas tank, the name of the chopper is Grace, and so he rides off after this moment of redemption on Grace. And so this, you know, just this...
It's very Flannery O'Connor.
Very much. And so this idea, like the heroes are the ones who effectively embrace form, who kind of try to rescue some semblance of meaning from the formlessness that, you know, Hollywood in many ways represents. That's why I think, you know, he is kind of tongue-in-cheek praising Hollywood in this latest film. But even that, it's a false ending. And there's this sort of moment of apotheosis of Leonardo DiCaprio's character that it's fake. Mm-hmm. You know, if you take a step back, you know, it's nice, it's comforting, but it's not substantial. And so I do think he has kind of a critique on the modern formlessness. And in no way is he a Christian necessarily. I think he's inescapably going to be influenced by Christian views, and it's going to come through in his work. But I think in general, he's trying to sort of rescue meaning in his stories.
I often wonder with artists like this who create work that is not distinctively Christian, but clearly incorporates Christian ideas or is wrestling with Christian ideas. I often wonder if they are really wrestling with this themselves, or if they just think that it makes a compelling story, if that makes sense.
I think it's so written into our psyche.
Right.
I don't believe in archetypes as a metaphysical reality, but they're kind of helpful to conceptualize the idea that the Christian archetypes of what a hero does, a hero sacrifices themselves. It's the very Christ-like thing to do. That's so ingrained in who we are. And you can see that from any culture, why that would be a valuable thing. Somebody who is willing to subordinate their own good for the good of the community. In a tribal mentality, that would, and I'm sure there are countless stories of those in different mythologies and things of that nature. But there's something about sort of the transcendent value of it, that it's not just a local good, it's a transcendent, eternal good. That, I think, is harder to identify in a lot of these works. But to see the value of, again, what we can really identify as Christian goods or Christian narratives, they're inescapable. There was a miniseries a couple years ago on HBO called Rome, and the character that played Mark Antony in sort of one of the extras or one of the DVDs that had sort of uncut interview footage.
Yeah, special features stuff.
Yeah, that's right. James Purifoy, the guy who played Mark Antony, he kind of made an interesting comment that for them to get into a pre-Christian way of thinking was very difficult. They didn't anticipate how hard it was, because so much of our life, even in a post-Christian world, is influenced by Christian ethos, the value of the individual, at least an ostensible value for life, that you don't just go and beat somebody over the head and take what's theirs because you want to and get away with it. To get it around a Christian mentality, just that comment that he made, that's hard. And so, in storytelling, I can imagine similarly that's very difficult. At the same time, there's a reason why superhero films are so popular,
right?
Because it's this sort of Christ-like figure, this image of someone who, in many ways, is larger than life. Although superhero films have been starting to humanize the characters a lot more intensely, but you still see in that senses of justice, self-sacrifice, integrity, commitment, other family values, things of that nature.
All the things that Nietzsche hated.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the nostalgia that Tarantino has for the old days of Hollywood, and you've also briefly talked about his new movie, but what are your thoughts on the new movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
I definitely have to tip my hat to Bishop Robert Barron, and he's got a recently released YouTube video on that.
I'll link it in the show notes, yeah.
Yeah, it's excellent. But, having seen that, and I still am processing it a little bit, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but I do believe it's this confrontation between sort of the projection into formlessness that the West threw itself, and Hollywood being kind of the tip of the spear, and these characters that in many ways come from a different time. Intentional, it probably is intentional, like the setting of the main character having made his real a name for himself in Westerns. Westerns in literature and in film have always been a way to consider different moral issues removed from our present context. Same thing with sci-fi.
Right.
It becomes a helpful medium to consider things that otherwise might have too much sort of baggage because it's too close to us. And so, these guys who kind of came from a particular cut are sort of nearing the end of their careers as the world is turning. Mm-hmm. And just
so these are guys who started movies like Magnificent Seven or High Noon or something like that.
Yeah, they're all sort of internal to the Tarantino universe.
Yeah.
But
just movies like that as an example.
Yeah,
gunslinging hero saves a town.
Exactly.
Stuff, yeah.
Kids would have wanted to watch this show every week. Had posters of them on their walls.
Right.
Just the spotless hero. That was kind of the mentality, and so then you start to see that shift. Their private lives behind off screen, and then how that dynamic interrelates with other people, and then again what the world was turning into around them, and how to cope with that.
I heard a review about this that talked about how Tarantino used period music very painstakingly, which speaks to the attention to detail that he has in his films, and every sequence, every soundbite is carefully selected and chosen. But apparently it's very true to the decades when it's sort of recounting the time through Hollywood. It's very true to what was going on then and what was playing on the radio at the time and things like that, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. He's and that's why he's so fun to watch, is because he does care about the details. and things are consistent. They have sort of a richness to it. There's a texture to his films that you really don't see in many other films.
I also understand there's almost an hour-long sequence that's a spaghetti Western in the movie. Is that right?
Pretty close. Yeah.
What do you make of that?
He's a big fan of those, and I think maybe because of that nostalgia, that clarity,
just
that
wanted
form.
to have some fun.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. I think he's free to have fun.
Yeah,
he makes films that he enjoys making, and that's you hear a lot of musical artists. They write songs that they enjoy listening to. That seems to be generally a recipe for success. Exceptions always exist, but the fact that he enjoys what he does and that he's drawing on these different images and characters and movies and inspirations, that's worked for him. A few of his movies, I think he probably needed to go back to a little bit more of that, and not be so not trying to make such a point about certain things. But that's another podcast, I suppose. Well,
I'm excited to see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Based on what I've heard about it and read about it, it seems like it might be one of his more interesting films.
It's definitely the best of his last three. Last four, maybe. Inglourious Basterds. What this is now number 9.
I can I'll look up the order, but because he has one more, right? He said he's going to make 10.
That's what I heard.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
who knows? I was nervous about this one just because the content or having to do with the Tate murders and
right.
Charles Manson. Like, how are you going to do this? And tread lightly. It is still way too soon.
Right.
But
he, from what I understand, and I don't want to spoil it either, but I listened to a podcast with spoilers, and it sounds like he figured out a way to tread around it that.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
And actually Tate's sister was initially against it, read the script, met with Tarantino, and she approved it.
Oh, okay. Wow. Mm-hmm. So let's see the movies that he has directed. So starting with Pulp Fiction, right? Reservoir Dogs, right?
Yep.
So Reservoir Dogs, Reservoir Dogs, can't say it. Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, Kill Bill 1 and 2, Grindhouse, Inglourious Basterds, Django, Hateful Eight, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah. Yep.
So this is the best one since Inglourious Basterds.
I would say, yeah.
All right.
I mean, Django, it wasn't my favorite. I think that's he was really trying to lay heavy into certain racial issues that were very much in the news, and they still are, obviously. But I can't remember the exact timing, but you started to see a lot of the different riots and things like that going on around the country. But one of the things I like about Django Unchained is sort of the image of redemption woven into that story itself. You've got literally Django, who is rescued from slavery by a dentist, but it seems to be in this movie that the teeth are kind of an image of the soul. And, Django originally had pretty bad teeth proper to the time. And this dentist, in many ways, is kind of like a Christ figure as the dentist, rescuing him from this. And as he spends more time with him, his teeth get better. Django's his love interest, she has perfect teeth. She's kind of a pure soul. You see the arch villain, also played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and then his sidekick Samuel L. Jackson. They've got horrible teeth, and DiCaprio's character is Mr. Candy. Candy rots your teeth. He's kind of the devil. Yeah. And you see it in his behavior, and he's very maniacal. But just sort of that image again of redemption woven through in such a very simple way that.
Bad teeth.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's impressive. Okay. Well, as a final note here, I don't want to scandalize anybody who now listens to this and thinks they need to go watch all Tarantino films. So what would you say to someone who's interested in watching these? I mean, do we need to issue a watch with caution thing here? Or is it, I think it might be helpful for people to just, to go see it and then pray through what they saw, because I think there's stuff to process there. And I think that these things can help us better encounter our human condition, but we should be intentional about the way we do that. What would you say?
Perennial advice: know yourself. Know yourself. If this is something that you want to dip your big toe into the water, maybe start with Jackie Brown, and kind of expand out from there. But always with whatever movies we watch, TV shows, music we listen to, never be uncritical. We should never just sort of passively consume things. Every movie, book, song is a manifestation of the human condition in one way, shape, or form, conscious or unconscious. And to find that, we can see things that are helpful, that can sort of expand not only our imagination, but our capacity for empathy, for compassion, but also to help kind of make us a bit more aware and realistic about the human condition, and seeing within these varieties of expressions the highest aspirations or some of the deepest longings that people have, whether it's just for sense and meaning, or more explicitly in certain works for God, for redemption, for forgiveness. So yeah, tread lightly, know yourself. Start with, like I said, Jackie Brown. It's a good one. That's probably got more mild.
Yeah.
And then, from there, see how you do, and then maybe go from there. Look at, Pulp Fiction is kind of the standard.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, well, thank you. The final thing, I try to ask this of every guest who comes on, but I love ending by talking about a saint. So what saint has been on your mind lately that we should know about?
I've got a kind of a friendship. I like to speak about friendships with saints because I really do think that they kind of pick us, especially with our namesakes. But a friendship that I've really appreciated with a saint most recently is kind of a longtime friend, Saint Jose Maria Escriva. And I've just had the opportunity to share some of the benefits that I've learned or sort of received over the years from that friendship. And he's very much a saint about holiness in the ordinary things, that sometimes we can either whitewash the faith and sort of make it something that it's not, robbing it of grace, robbing it of sort of its grittiness, but also just looking to consider how we do things, and doing them well is part of our road to holiness. So whether it's being a movie director, whether it's an actor, whether it's a writer, whether it's being a janitor, whatever we do, to do it with a certain amount of intentionality, and to see in those moments, just kind of the ordinary moments, really concrete opportunities for grace to enter into our lives.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I've appreciated his ideas, because sometimes it's hard as a Catholic who is often caught up in the mundane tasks of daily life, and being a dad and changing diapers and things like that. It's hard to feel like you're engaged in a holy vocation, but I think St. Jose Maria reminded all of us that we're all called to holiness no matter what we're doing. So that's a great reminder. I also appreciate St. Therese for similar reasons, just that she talked about the little way. And it's very easy to be daunted by biographies of saints like St. Catherine of Siena, because she was not a little unextraordinary person. She was a very extraordinary person who did great things. And so when you read her story, for example, it's easy to think, I'm never going to be like this. So I love St. Therese and St. Jose Maria for reminding us that that's not what God calls all of us to do.
Right.
So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us on Creedal Catholic. Hopefully you want to come back again soon and talk about some other things. But I love talking about Quentin Tarantino movies with you, and we'll talk about number 10 when that one comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.